Hey everyone, back again. Today I'm going to talk about Giorgio Agamben's idea or notion of Homo Sacer. Now before jumping into that, if you want to follow me anywhere other than here, you can find me on Instagram at theory_and_philosophy or on Twitter at David Guigno. If you're new here, welcome. I'm David. I try to explain philosophical texts and ideas in a way that makes them accessible to help you along your philosophical journey. So if you're new, make sure to subscribe. I'd love to see you back. If you want to help me out, you can do that by simply subscribing, liking, sharing, telling your friends, commenting, all that stuff. We gotta pump that algorithm a little bit. If you're listening to this in podcast form, you'll be able to find the video on YouTube. If you found this on YouTube, you'll be able to find this in podcast form anywhere where you get podcasts where there shouldn't be any ads, at least for now. If you are listening to this in podcast form, perhaps on Apple Podcasts, leave a review. 5 stars would help me out a lot. And yeah. You can help me out via Patreon or PayPal if you want to, but obviously no pressure. And I don't want to waste any more of your time with that stuff. Let's talk about Homo Sacer, which is a complicated term, and I want to be quite upfront. I'm not going to be able to discuss every single part of this, especially the history of the term that Agamben is drawing from. You really have to read the entire book, Homo Sacer, or Sacer, whatever, for that. I'm just going to give you kind of a bare bones understanding of it to get your feet off the ground, essentially, and open up some possible criticisms I have of it and some of the ways that it informs perhaps Foucaultian notions of biopolitics or works against them to some extent as well. So let's jump into it. Now, at the core of the term Homo Sacer is a kind of ambivalence. And the reason that there's an ambivalence is because sacer quite literally can refer to sacred. And when we think of sacred, we probably think someone who's exalted, maybe they're held in high esteem. But the tradition and the language, etymologically, that Agamben is drawing from actually paints the notion of sacredness or sacer in this way in a kind of negative light as well, where someone who was considered to be sacred or sacer was someone that could also be seen as being like dirty, like someone you weren't supposed to come in contact with, someone that could actually be like ostracized from the political order. Now, the reason he's digging into this question of sacredness is because, and he's really speaking to Walter Benjamin here, and the kind of question that Walter Benjamin opens about the sacredness of life in relation to divine law and what divine law might mean. And I've done an episode on Benjamin's text, The Critique of Violence, which you can find and check out on here if you want. But Agamben is really curious about this because there's been a kind of naive assumption that sacredness, is referring to something that is held in high esteem, something that is seen as being something to protect. Now, Agamben shows, because it is also associated with this kind of notion of being dirty, this image of dirtiness, that they are someone who has to be excluded. Now, that serves a very instrumental function for Agamben in constituting a political order, but we're gonna get there in a minute. We're gonna build here and arrive to that point. But that is essentially the end goal that Agamben wants to arrive at. So Homo Sacer is a person, is a human, who is both beneath the law and outside of the law. That is, they are someone whose life can't be used to propitiate, which is a fancy word for saying that cannot feed or cannot be sacrificed, is someone whose life can't mean anything really for those people in authority, for the dominant social order. So, for example, they are so beneath life, they are so beneath citizenship, let's say, especially as we're referring to this in relation to the Roman tradition that he's really picking up on here, and the Greeks as well. Homo Sacer is someone who's beneath citizenship, and so their life means nothing in terms of a sacrificial order. So you cannot sacrifice a Homo Sacer with the hope of getting something from the gods, like have your crops grow or something like that. They are seen as being less than that. At the same time, they are also someone whose life means nothing even if they're killed. So if you were to kill one of these people, or if they were to be killed, what that would mean was that nothing would befall you because it was like you weren't even killing a human. So their lives couldn't be sacrificed to the gods, and their lives meant like nothing within the political order, which is very strange considering our perhaps immediate understanding of what a sacred person is. But historically, as Agamben shows, they are someone whose life could neither be used to propitiate the gods, nor could be seen as being something worth defending or punishing if they were to be killed by someone else. So the person who killed them couldn't be punished. Now, the emergence of this kind of figure, this person that can be killed with impunity, essentially, where nothing bad will happen, can only come about in a certain phase, or a certain stage, a certain kind of mode of social organization, one that Agamben attributes specifically to the emergence of sovereign power, because it is the sovereign who has the capacity to kill without that killing being in the service of anything so-called meaningful in terms of a sacrificial order, or the killing being something that could then be retribution can be paid for it in the form of disciplinary measures or whatever. So the sovereign is the person who is given the potential, given the, authority to kill without committing homicide, and to, in that same act of killing, do it without it meaning anything in a sacrificial way. Because in the case of like a sacrifice, that person would hardly, the executioner, would hardly be someone considered to have committed a homicide, because it is part of that social order as being something that is approved, allowed for. Now in this phase, or this kind of mode of social organization, in this social sphere, people are viewed as being less than, these specific people are viewed as being less than worthy to sacrifice, and so they can be killed with impunity. Now, at this point, they are reduced to what Agamben calls, and what he draws from etymologically, they are reduced to a kind of bare life, where all they are is a living being. And because they are only a living being, they're just flesh, essentially, they don't actually have any real meaning, and so they can be killed with absolutely no consequence. And so even though a person is held as being sacred, and we know now that that sacredness is not something to really be excited about, it serves a pretty instrumental function in that it is a necessary part of the establishment of sovereign power. So in that sense, it is kind of sacred. It's a necessary component and something we must strive for if we want to establish this kind of social organization, which is obviously not a great one. But these people are held in a kind of strange inverse exaltation where they are seen as being a necessary component of this system, precisely because they can be taken out of that system via killing without any kind of repercussions. Now, this is how Agamben establishes his own form of biopolitics, where people are reduced to a kind of life only, and it is in that moment that they can then be killed without any kind of repercussions occurring. Now, this is both similar and different from the kind of biopolitics we get in Foucault, because Foucault doesn't pay quite as much attention to this possibility of death coming from this focus on life. In fact, he considers more about what the proliferation of life means in terms of power. Whereas Agamben is saying this proliferation of life, this acknowledgement of things as life, has pretty negative consequences, because then it strips people of anything beyond their flesh, because it strips them of anything beyond their zoe, being the term he draws upon here, anything other than their lifeness. They don't have any kind of meaning beyond that. And that's a very scary moment, because it reduces people to that, just their biology, which houses no meaning in itself. Now, he uses the example of the Holocaust to also illustrate this, where the Jewish people, among other people at the time, were reduced to this kind of bare life. They had their rights taken, citizenship taken, everything like that, and reduced to only life. And he calls this a form of biopolitics in that way. And he says that obviously opened the door for this thing called the Holocaust, for that event that is still very much unimaginable, that still occurred. Now, there's an issue that I have with this, just to give my own input, in that he reduces the Holocaust to like a kind of teleological inevitability to this thing called sovereign power and bare life. And while that may be true, in that we have certainly set the conditions for these types of events to occur, and they have occurred all across the world in terms of, as a result of this kind of sovereign power that he sketches. I think that he is too quick not to see the specificity of an event like the Holocaust as representing something more than just a kind of teleological consequence of this form of sovereign power, in that there were so many other historical situations that played a part, like the historical treatment of Jewish people certainly contributed to this. It wasn't just any people, and we can't lose sight of that fact. Like, the treatment of the Jewish people all throughout the world for thousands of years contributed to this as well. This is not just the demonstration of a kind of sovereign power that did this because it could. It was a sovereign power that also had these other baked in prejudices, and I think that Agamben downplays that to some extent. And that is really it. There's, to give you kind of basic introduction, there's not really much more to add than that. But of course you get a lot more if you actually read the text. But yeah, if anyone, you listen this far, I'd love to hear what anyone else had to say, what you think might be worth adding. If anyone puts a comment in that's really good, I love pinning them, so that everyone can see anything that should be added, or if I mischaracterized anything, I'd love to hear about it. But yeah, if you like what I did here, leave 5 stars, like, share, review, and catch you next time. Take care.